as a portion of its floor and the whole interior of a long archway through which we reached it were carefully sheathed with copper. The door of massive iron had been also similarly protected. Its immense weight caused an unusually sharp grating sound as it moved upon its hinges.
Now, let's just make sure at level 1 we know what we're talking about here. What actually happens right now in this story? His sister dies, and he says, before we officially bury her, I want to just kind of leave her in this room under the house so that we can do some research on her for science medical purposes, and I need your help putting her in the room. So in this freaky mansion, in the middle of the freaky woods, we have a freaky room underneath the mansion that's a small room that at one time was used as a dungeon keep for torturing people, and then later maybe to put munitions like gunpowder in. A room lined with copper, this small room that allows for no light, and they got to go up and push the door open because it hasn't. Nobody's been in this room for a long time, and this is where they're going to put the body of his sister. Again, you can kind of write down already at level 3A. Is there 1 or 2 movies that come to mind where at one scary point in the film, a room starts to become the center of the film? Not the house anymore, but a room in the house where, guess what? You got to get the door open. And the door is not so easy to open. Why? Because nobody's been in there for a while. All of those kinds of movies track back to this famous story. Let's keep going now. He's going to help Usher not bury, his sister, who is dead, maybe.
Having deposited our mournful burden upon trestles within this region of horror, we partially turned aside the yet unscrewed lid of the coffin and looked upon the face of the tenant. A striking similitude between the brother and sister now first arrested my attention, and Usher, divining perhaps my thoughts, murmured out some words from which I learned that the deceased and himself had been twins, and that sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. Our glances, however, rested not long upon the dead, for we could not regard her unawed. The disease which had thus entombed the lady in the maturity of youth had left, as usual in all maladies of a strictly cataleptical character, the mockery of a faint blush upon the bosom and the face, and that suspiciously lingering smile upon the lip, which is so terrible in death. We replaced and screwed down the lid, and, having secured the door of iron, made our way with toil into the scarcely less gloomy apartments of the upper portion of the house.
Now, it might be that you are starting to learn how to read Poe a little bit better, and so you actually were able to make out quite a bit of that last paragraph. Lots of stuff happening in that paragraph. Notice what he says. 1, we took her coffin down under the ground into this room. 2, for reasons nobody will explain, Usher wants to look one last time at his sister, and so they take the lid off of the coffin so that he can look at her face. 3, the narrator reports that he discovers she looks just like him. Remember, he only briefly glanced at Madeline before when she was alive. And he looks at her face, then he looks at Usher's face, and he's like, dude, you guys look exactly alike. And Usher then says, well, there's a reason for that too. She is my twin sister, and we have been close all our life. Then Usher looks back at her body again, and he says, very strange, this death of hers. She looked still alive, like she was sleeping, but not alive. A little bit of a smile on her face. Oh, well, he said, we put the lid back on the coffin, and then we barred the door shut. All in one paragraph, the genius of Poe. He can say all of what we just said in the most remarkable of prose, and of course leading you, the reader, to go, so you've got this girl in the room in a basement right beneath whose bedroom? The narrator's, who didn't want to be in this creepy place anyway. Now he gets to go to sleep that night knowing full well there's a dead body in the room right below him. For any of us that kind of a little freaked out by this kind of thing, as we read a story like this, we can join with Poe's readers originally to go, yes, this is a good, scary kind of story. Why? Because it sets up the reader. Let's point this out at 2B real quickly. What makes good short fiction of the horror genre, the Gothic genre, is it makes you want to ask the question, what happens next? Now, in a time, I find myself oddly saying this, but it's true, in a time right now when the #1 addiction among a whole lot of kids your age is this zombie addiction, how can you explain that within our culture, everything from ambulatory corpses, what I call AC, Walking Dead, all the way down to a lot of the video games that get played, have a lot to do with zombies? Why are zombies so fascinating to modern culture? Are they alive or are they dead? And of course the correct answer is yes, right? Where does this fascination start with? Guys, Poe has a lot to do with this, quite frankly. He will inject into the popular psyche the idea of the undead. Let's go ahead now and continue with our reading. And for those of you who maybe now are a little bit more interested in the story than you were 3 pages back, dude, what's going to happen next? Here we go.
And now, some days of bitter grief having elapsed, an observable change came over the features of the mental disorder of my friend. His ordinary manner had vanished. His ordinary occupations were neglected or forgotten. He roamed from chamber to chamber with hurried, unequal, and objectless step. The pallor of his countenance had assumed, if possible, a more ghastly hue, but the luminousness of his eye had utterly gone out. The once occasional huskiness of his tone was heard no more, and a tremulous quaver, as if of extreme terror, habitually characterized his utterance. There were times, indeed, when I thought his unceasingly agitated mind was laboring with some oppressive secret, to divulge which he struggled for the necessary courage. At times, again, I was obliged to resolve all into the mere inexplicable vagaries of madness, for I beheld him gazing upon vacancy for long hours, in an attitude of the profoundest attention, as if listening to some imaginary sound. It was no wonder that his condition terrified, that it infected me. I felt creeping upon me, by slow yet uncertain degrees, the wild influences of his own fantastic yet impressive superstitions.
All right, so they bury Madeline, twin sister, under the floor. Then he says, Usher, he starts to lose it. He walks around the house, muttering weird things to himself, as if he could become any more pale. He has, totally losing it. Last paragraph, page 305. If you haven't been reading and been just listening, now I really challenge you to try and read some of these words going forward. Last paragraph, 305. Gee, I wonder what's going to happen next.
It was especially upon retiring to bed late in the night of the 7th or 8th day after the placing of the Lady Madeline within the dungeon that I experienced the full power of such feelings. Sleep came not near my couch, while the hours waned and waned away. I struggled to reason off the nervousness which had dominion over me. I endeavored to believe that much, if not all, of what I felt was due to the bewildering influence of the gloomy furniture of the room, of the dark and tattered draperies, which, tortured into motion by the breath
Top
of
of
a
page
rising
306.
tempest, swayed fitfully to and fro upon the walls, and rustled uneasily about the decorations of the bed. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor gradually pervaded my frame, and at length there sat upon my very heart an incubus of utterly causeless alarm. Shaking this off with a gasp and a struggle, I uplifted myself upon the pillows, and peering earnestly within the intense darkness of the chamber, hearkened, I know not why, except that an instinctive spirit prompted me to certain low and indefinite sounds which came through the pauses of the storm at long intervals I knew not whence. Overpowered by an intense sentiment of horror, unaccountable yet unendurable, I threw on my clothes with haste, for I felt that I should sleep no more during the night, and endeavored to arouse myself from the pitiable condition into which I had fallen by pacing rapidly to and fro through the apartment.
Now, he says, I can't remember day 7, day 8. It's been a week. Sister's been down there, buried. He said, finally, I can't sleep that night. It's stormy outside. Let's put that in our notes. You gotta have crazy happening. It helps a lot if you've got bad weather. Think about it 3A. All of the movies that for you are scary movies, and ask the simple question, if in the scariest moment of the film, the weather turns bad. Go ahead, just ask yourself that question. Is it raining? Is the wind blowing? See what I mean? All of this tracks back for Poe rather nicely. We've got a nasty stormy night, and he says, I can't sleep. And then all of a sudden, I swear, I can hear sounds. Weird sounds. Coming from where? I don't know. But he says, I get up out of my bed, and I start pacing. That means walking. Back and forth, back and forth. Notice our narrator is starting to take on some of the same kinds of temperament actions as Roderick. Usher.
I had taken but few turns in this manner when a light step on an adjoining staircase arrested my attention. I presently recognized it as that of Usher. In an instant afterward, he rapped with a gentle touch at my door and entered, bearing a lamp. His countenance was as usual cadaverously wan.
He looks dead.
But moreover, there was a species of mad hilarity in his eyes, and evidently restrained hysteria in his whole demeanor. His air appalled me, but anything was preferable to the solitude which I had so long endured, and I even welcomed his presence as a relief. And have you not seen it? He said abruptly, after having stared about him for some moments in silence. You have not then seen it? But stay, you shall. Thus speaking, and having carefully shaded his lamp, he hurried to one of the casements and threw it freely open to the storm.
So, he says, I'm walking around in my room, stormy night, hearing sounds, freaky, when all of a sudden I hear coming up the stairs or down the stairs, I hear footsteps, and it's Usher. And he walks in with his candle, and he says, his face looks like a dead person, totally pale. And he says animatedly, have you seen it? You saw it, right? You saw it. And then he goes over to the window and he throws the window open. Our narrator, just like you, the reader, are going, what is about to happen? If Poe does anything right, he convinces you to keep reading, right? Which is what writers always do.
The impetuous fury of the entering gust nearly lifted us from our feet. It was indeed a tempestuous yet sternly beautiful night, and one wildly singular in its terror and its beauty. A whirlwind had apparently collected its force in our vicinity, for there were frequent and violent alterations in the direction of the wind, and the exceeding density of the clouds, which hung so low as to press upon the turrets of the house, did not prevent our perceiving the lifelike velocity with which they flew, careering from all points against each other, without passing away into the distance. I say that even their exceeding density did not prevent our perceiving this, yet we had no glimpse of the moon or stars, nor was there any flashing forth of the lightning. But the undersurfaces of the huge masses of agitated vapor, as well as all terrestrial objects immediately around us, were glowing in the unnatural light of a faintly luminous and distinctly visible gaseous exhalation which hung about and enshrouded the mansion.
So he looks out the window and he says, there's light, but it ain't lightning. He says, you look out the window and it looks like there's a glowing that's happening all in the air around the house. Not lightning, but nasty windstorm and this kind of like It's like the house is glowing or coming alive. Of course, for those of you that have spent any time with the old Steve Spielberg film and now a new making of that film, Poltergeist, you now know where that film came from as well. Another observation of 3A. I told you, this is a really influential story in the history of scary stories, right? What happens next, I wonder?
You must not, you shall not behold this, said I, shuddering to Usher.
Top of page 307.
Violence from the window to a seat. These appearances which bewilder you are merely electrical phenomena, not uncommon, or it may be that they have their ghastly origin in the rank miasma of the tarn. Let us close this casement. The air is chilling and dangerous to your frame. Here's one of your favorite romances. I will read and you shall listen, and so we will pass away this terrible night together. The antique volume which I had taken up was The Mad Tryst of Sir Launcelot Canning, but I had called it a favorite of Usher's more in sad jest than in earnest, for in truth there is little in its uncouth and unimaginative prolixity which could have had interest for the lofty and spiritual ideality of my friend. It was, however, the only book immediately at hand, and I indulged a vague hope that the excitement which now agitated the hypochondriac might find relief, for the history of mental disorder is full of similar anomalies, even in the extremeness of the folly which I should read. Could I have judged indeed by the wild, overstrained air of vivacity with which he hearkened, or apparently hearkened, to the words of the tale, I might well have congratulated myself upon the success of my design.
Now, what he says is, shut the window, this is crazy, we need to calm down, and I'm going to read a book to you. As your footnote will say at the bottom of 307, this is actually a fictitious book and a fictitious author. Poe is just making it up as he goes. But he says, I started reading the book to Usher to try and calm him down. You, of course, have a sense that there will be no calming. We're moving towards the penultimate, inevitable end of our story. Things can't go well, right?
I had arrived at that well-known portion of the story where Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, having sought in vain for peaceable admission into the dwelling of the hermit, proceeds to make good an entrance by force. Here, it will be remembered, the words of the narrative run thus: And Ethelred, who was by nature of a doughty heart, and who was now mighty withal, on account of the powerfulness of the wine which he had drunken, waited no longer to hold parley with the hermit, who in sooth was of an obstinate and maliceful turn, but feeling the rain upon his shoulders, and fearing the rising of the tempest, uplifted his mace outright, and with blows made quickly room in the plankings of the door for his gauntleted hand. And now, pulling therewith sturdily, he so cracked and ripped and tore all asunder that the noise of the dry and hollow-sounding wood alarmed and reverberated throughout the forest. At the termination of this sentence, I started, and for a moment paused.
Here it comes.
For it appeared to me, although I at once concluded that my excited fancy had deceived me, it appeared to me that from some very remote portion of the mansion, there came indistinctly to my ears, which might have been, in its exact similarity of character, the echo, but a stifled and dull one certainly, of the very cracking and ripping sound which Sir Launcelot had so particularly described.
Now, I had a student that read this story in one sitting at 2 in the morning, she said. She had to get her annotative work done, and she had put it off, and she didn't know anything about the story, but she was a very good reader. And so she didn't read any plot summary. She just sat down and started reading the story. And she said, strangely, the weather starts to get kind of nasty outside as she starts reading the story. And then all of a sudden, when she gets to this point, he's just finished reading from a fake novel about some strange cracking sound that's happening in the floor. All of a sudden, he says, from the bottom, underneath my floor in the mansion, I start to hear some strange groaning sound. And my student said she was reading, and all of a sudden something fell in her room, you know, just kind of fell off the shelf or whatever, and totally freaked her out. And she was like, I realized then that Poe had me. I was totally into the story, like what's going to happen next, as the sound in the house starts to become more audible. If you're reading this on a dark, stormy night in your bedroom with the lights all out, it might freak you out a bit. People loved this stuff. They loved reading this part of the story out loud in Poe-zone time.
It was beyond doubt the coincidence alone which had arrested my attention. For amid the rattling of the sashes of the casements and the ordinary commingled noises of the still increasing storm, the sound itself had nothing, surely, which should have interested or disturbed me.
Top of page 308.
But the good champion Ethelred,
Back to
now
reading.
entering within the door, was sore enraged and amazed to perceive no signal of the maliceful hermit, but in the stead thereof a dragon of a scaly and prodigious demeanor, and of a fiery tongue, which sate in guard before a palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and upon the wall there hung a shield of shining brass with this legend enwritten: Who entereth herein a conqueror hath been, who slayeth the dragon, this shield he shall win. And Ethelred uplifted his mace, and struck upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and gave up his pasty breath, with a shriek so horrid and harsh, and withal so piercing, that Ethelred had fain to close his ears with his hands against the dreadful noise of it, the like whereof was never before heard.
Now, again, Poe is in fine form. He is inventing a story within his story. In other words, this Lancelot story about killing the dragon, it's one that Poe just makes up for this story. But our narrator says, I start reading this story to him about Lancelot fighting with this dragon, but there's these weird sounds that are starting to happen. Dude, within the house, something is going on. What will happen next?
Here again I paused abruptly, and now with a feeling of wild amazement, for there could